In the history of modern golf, Vijay Singh is a name tied to numbers that would make any athlete bow their head. More than 30 PGA Tour wins, 3 prestigious major titles, multiple seasons leading the money list, and 32 weeks at the top of the world rankings during the most fierce period of the Tiger Woods era. He is one of the very few golfers not born in the cradle of golf, America or Europe, who still reached the absolute pinnacle of this sport, shattering every prejudice about background, training systems, and privilege. Vijay Singh did not just win the biggest tournaments. He won during years when every round was a brutal battle of physical strength, technique, and mental fortitude, where even one small mistake was enough to be swallowed whole. He wore the World No.1 jacket, not through glamour or adoration, but through iron discipline, ruthless endurance with his own body, and a will that allowed no retreat. On the record books, Vijay is the model of absolute success, stable, efficient, cold, and fearsome. A man whose opponents knew that as long as he was still on the course, he remained the greatest threat. But behind those victories, another story quietly exists, one that is mentioned far less, heavier, and far more lonely. Because alongside the life of a champion, Vijay Singh also had to live another life, one where he was never allowed to relax, never allowed to be weak, and never truly allowed to feel safe. Doubts followed him like a shadow. Suspicious glances did not disappear even when he stood at the very top. And each victory, instead of bringing release, became evidence, forcing him to keep proving himself. There, Vijay's will was not something that burned brightly, but something that smoldered, hardened, built from the pain of exclusion, the feeling of belonging nowhere, and the fear that if he slowed down even slightly, everyone would turn away. One life as the champion the whole world sees, and another life as the lonely man, bracing himself against his own history, living in silence, enduring in silence, and continuing to move forward, not for glory, but because that was the only way to survive. If you want to continue exploring the story behind the victories and step into the next part, where Vijay Singh's real life begins to take an even harsher turn, please hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you for joining me, and we'll continue in the next part, where the spotlight gradually fades and the silent burdens begin to emerge. Born in Fiji, Vijay Singh entered life in a place where the golf world had hardly ever turned its gaze. A beautiful but remote island, lying outside every map of fame, outside every training system, outside every pre-designed dream for talented children. There were no prestigious golf academies, no meticulously maintained practice ranges, no sponsors ready to spot and nurture a future star. Fiji, in Vijay's childhood memories, was harsh sunlight, salty sea winds, long afternoons where time passed so slowly that one could feel left behind by the world. His family was of Indian descent in Fiji, living simply, without privilege, without connections, without a paved path. His father, an aircraft technician, loved golf and personally taught his son the first swings, not with modern curricula, but with the raw patience of a man who understood that if he didn't pass on what he knew, this child would have nothing to hold on to. Golf came to Vijay not as an elegant sport, but as a tool for survival, the only language that could help that boy communicate with the world beyond the isolated island. From a very young age, Vijay sensed a cold truth. No one was waiting for him, no one had prepared an opportunity, and no one had any obligation to believe in a kid from Fiji. Other children could dream freely, could make mistakes while experimenting, could rely on family or community, but Vijay could not. Every practice session, every swing carried within it a silent pressure, as if he were telling himself that if he didn't do better than yesterday, didn't take one more step forward, this fragile door would close forever. The feeling of being overlooked didn't come from one big event, but seeped in gradually through each day, through having no one to compare himself to, no one to compete with, no one to prove that this path was possible. Fiji was too small for big dreams, and Vijay was too alone to believe the world would naturally open its arms. It was in those circumstances that a very early loneliness formed, not loud, not sharply painful, but persistent and cold. Like growing up without ever being asked if he was tired, the boy Vijay learned to be silent, learned to observe himself, adjust himself, take responsibility for even the smallest mistakes, because there was no one behind him to correct them or pat him on the shoulder for comfort. While others played golf for joy, Vijay played out of fear of falling behind, of being forgotten, of being trapped forever in a place no one remembered. From very early on, he understood that if he didn't save himself, no one would, and that realization was both a driving force and a burden weighing on the shoulders of a child who hadn't yet had a proper childhood. In the wild beauty of Fiji, Vijay grew up with a seriousness unfit for his age, with a quiet determination that needed no witnesses, and with a painful belief that the road ahead would have no room for weakness. That loneliness didn't make him collapse, but it carved deeply into how he viewed the world. Always vigilant, always prepared, always ready to endure more than others. And it was from that forgotten land, from a family that had nothing but perseverance, that a parallel life began to take shape. One where Vijay Singh was both the boy, teaching himself how to survive, and the future man who would carry that sense of abandonment with him for the rest of his days, no matter where he stood later in life. Vijay Singh's childhood passed in a way that people wouldn't typically call childhood, because there was almost no room for carefree, quiet moments, noisy games, or afternoons spent just daydreaming about things yet to come. Golf didn't simply enter that boy's life as a sport. It quietly took over his entire living space, replacing the things a child should rightfully have. While other kids in Fiji ran barefoot on the sandy beaches, climbed trees, and laughed until sunset, Vijay stayed behind with old clubs, repeating swings until his palms were worn raw. It wasn't because he didn't want to play with them, but because a hard-to-name sense of distance formed in him early, as if he were living on a different rhythm, slower but heavier, where every passing hour carried an invisible demand to be better than yesterday. Friends gradually became a vague concept, not because Vijay looked down on them, but because he had no time and wouldn't allow himself to waste time on things that didn't lead to a clear escape. Entertainment was a luxury for him, because every idle minute stirred up the fear that he was standing still, while the world out there kept moving forward without waiting. Practice sessions didn't end when his body was tired. They only stopped when the light was no longer enough to see the ball fly. Golf became an obligation for survival, a daily job to complete, like eating, sleeping, and breathing. There were no cheers, no coach patting him on the back for encouragement, no words of praise to nurture a young joy. There was only the silence of the practice ground and the feeling that if he didn't endure enough today, tomorrow he would pay the price. In that monotony, Vijay learned a lesson that came too early and too harshly. Emotions are something that can slow your steps, and weakness is a luxury that doesn't fit his circumstances. That boy didn't allow himself to complain when he failed, nor did he allow himself to celebrate too long when he did well, because everything was only temporary, and the only safety lay in keeping moving forward. Vijay's childhood had no soaring dreams, because daydreaming didn't help him hit the ball farther or more accurately. Instead, there was a clear awareness of responsibility for his own future, a burden he carried from when he was still too young to fully understand its meaning. Every mishit wasn't just a technical error. It was a reminder that this path was very narrow, and one slip could send him falling back to the starting point with no one remembering him. In that shrunken world, Vijay grew up faster than his age, thinking like an adult trapped in a child's body, always calculating, always adjusting, always asking himself if he had done enough yet. No one taught him how to balance, because no one around understood the pressure he placed on his own shoulders. Golf, in that way, was both his only friend and his most demanding taskmaster, never satisfied, never allowing negligence. And it was during those years that a dangerous habit gradually formed, tying his self-worth to performance, to results, to how much pain he could endure while still keeping going. The child Vijay didn't learn to dream of victory. He learned to accept fatigue as a natural part of life, learned to suppress every emotion inside, and learned to believe that if he was tough enough, disciplined enough, patient enough, then one day the world would be forced to see him. But the price of that lesson was a closed-off childhood, where innocence was replaced by vigilance and joy was replaced by duty. Looking back, one can see there not the image of a talent being nurtured, but the image of a child forging himself in solitude, learning to endure before he could learn to hope, and carrying that habit with him throughout his entire life, even later, when he had become a man standing on the biggest stages of the golf world. 1985 did not come to Vijay Singh as a clear turning point, no thunder to announce it, no dramatic moment where one could point and say, everything changed from here. It arrived quietly, silently, but left a cut so deep that for the rest of his life, it never truly closed. At that time, Vijay was still very young, still struggling to find his place in the international golf world, competing on the Asia golf circuit, carrying the longing to escape the edges of the world, and the belief that if he was hardworking enough, persistent enough, everything would eventually open up. But in that fragile context, an accusation was made. Vijay Singh was suspected of altering a scorecard. It wasn't an act caught red-handed in public, not a full hearing with lawyers, witnesses, and a clear conclusion. Just an allegation, a suspension decision, and a door slamming shut before he could even understand what was happening. Vijay denied it. He always denied it. But in a world where power didn't belong to the young, and even less to those coming from outside the system, that denial wasn't strong enough to change his fate. There was no public trial where he could speak fully, no final verdict to determine right or wrong, only a question mark hanging in the air and a cold consequence. His career was halted. At an age when many other golfers were starting to build experience, Vijay was suddenly pushed to the sidelines, carrying a stain that was never truly washed away. The most painful part wasn't the suspension from competition, but the fact that he was never given a full chance to clear his name, never faced a decisive conclusion to know where he stood. When there's no clear judgment, doubt becomes a permanent sentence, and silence becomes a prison that lasts decades. For someone who had grown used to tying his self-worth to discipline and effort, this blow didn't just hurt his career. It dug deep into how Vijay saw the world. He understood that from now on, every step he took would no longer be judged purely on results, but always examined through the lens of the past. Every good shot would be seen as luck, every mistake interpreted as evidence reinforcing the suspicion. And most frightening of all, even when he stayed silent and kept working, the shadow of that accusation would follow him like a record that could never be erased. In the years that followed, Vijay lived in a strange limbo, not convicted, but not exonerated, not completely erased, but not welcomed either. The golf world didn't need to condemn him publicly. Turning its back was enough to make an athlete disappear. And Vijay, once again, fell into the familiar position of his life, the outsider. Unlike the loneliness of childhood, this time, the isolation carried a quiet sense of humiliation, a feeling that no matter how hard he tried, there would always be a part of his past brought up whenever doubt was needed. He had no right to be angry, because anger would only make him look like he was hiding something. He had no right to complain, because complaining wouldn't change the decision already made. The only path left was silence, endurance, and continuing to work in the shadows. It was from that moment that a true parallel life took shape. On one side, Vijay remained a golfer, still practicing, still competing in places with fewer lights, farther from the centers of power, trying to keep his skills from fading. On the other, he became a man who always lived in a state of mental defense, always preparing for suspicion, judgment, and questions he had no full chance to answer. Every passing day was not just a day of practice, but a day he learned to carry an accusation he couldn't remove. The pain of 1985 didn't erupt into tears or a public crisis. It smoldered, seeping into every decision, every relationship, every way he viewed himself. Vijay understood that from now on, he would have to live better than others, work harder than others, be more disciplined than others, not to be admired, but just to survive. And even if he achieved all that, he wasn't sure he would be believed. Being condemned without a verdict is a cruel experience, because it doesn't allow one to close the past or move forward completely. It forces a person to carry an unanswered question for life. For Vijay Singh, 1985 was not just a dark year in his career record. It was the cut that shaped his entire way of walking in this world, the beginning of 30 years living in two parallel lives. One life of results, and one life of doubt. And no matter how high he later stood, that cut remained there, reminding him that there are pains that don't need to be named, but also never disappear. After 1985, Vijay Singh's life did not collapse. In the noisy way people usually imagine a tragedy, it quietly drained away, little by little, as if someone had erased his name from the golf world's map without any announcement. No more Asia Golf Circuit, no more doors leading to prestigious tournaments, no more pre-printed schedules for the future. Vijay was forced to leave the places that had once nurtured his dreams, carrying his clubs and a half-tarnished reputation, to begin a true life of wandering. He went to Africa, then Europe, competing in small events, on golf courses few people knew by name, where the stands were sparse, and the prize money sometimes barely covered travel costs. There were no cameras, no reporters, no one telling his story. Vijay walked onto the course like a worker starting his shift, did his part well, then quietly left, day after day, year after year. Golf was no longer the dream carrying him out into the world. It became pure work for survival, where each round was simply a way to keep existing, nothing more, nothing less. Small, scattered victories went unrecorded. Defeats went unmentioned. Everything vanished the moment the round ended, as if it had never happened. In that prolonged silence, Vijay gradually understood that he was living in a historical void, where his presence was not important enough to be remembered, but also not meaningless enough to disappear completely. He existed on the edge of the sport he loved, not invited to the center, but not pushed out of the game either. It was a suspended state, where hope was not big enough to nurture dreams, and despair was not strong enough to force someone to stop. Those years wore Vijay down in a very different way from failures on the course. It wasn't mishits that hurt him, but the feeling that he was striving in a world that no longer saw him. He practiced in cold mornings, self-correcting his technique, self-analyzing mistakes, self-reminding that if he didn't maintain discipline, he would slide deeper into oblivion. No coach standing beside him, no teammates, no one to share the fatigue. Everything happened in silence, and that very silence made the tragedy heavier than any shock. Vijay no longer played golf to prove anything to the world, but to prove to himself that he had not been completely defeated. But the more he tried, the more he realized a bitter truth. Effort is not always enough to be acknowledged. There were years when, no matter how well he played, the name Vijay Singh still did not appear on major newspapers, was not mentioned in discussions about golf's future. He became invisible in his own sport, a shadow moving across continents, carrying skill and pride, but not carrying a clear status. Golf, in that period, was no longer a place where he found joy or hope, but where he learned to endure indifference. Every time he picked up his clubs and headed to the course, he knew he was not expected, not favored, and not allowed to make mistakes. Mistakes meant disappearing, and disappearing at this stage could be permanent. That is why Vijay played with a smoldering tension, not the tension of top-level competition, but the tension of survival. He knew that if he stopped, if he gave up, no one would come back looking for him. There would be no redemption story, no welcomed return. The golf world would keep turning, and he would be left behind as if he had never existed. In those 10 years, Vijay Singh lived a life with his name erased, where every passing day was a test of will. He did not collapse, but he was not supported either. He was not praised, but he was not allowed to vanish. That was the tragedy of existing without acknowledgement, of continuing to walk while no one watched. And it was in that long, endless stretch of time that Vijay's true nature was forged, not a star craving the spotlight, but a man clinging tightly to his profession like the last life raft in an ocean of indifference. 10 years erased from the golf world's map did not just take away his youth, fame, and confidence. It also etched deep a bitter belief that if one day he returned, he would never be allowed to believe the world would open its arms to him. When Vijay Singh returned to America and stepped onto the PGA Tour, it was not a glorious homecoming, but the re-emergence of a name carrying a past that had never truly been closed. A man whose every achievement was scrutinized through the lens of suspicion. Vijay was not welcomed with inspiring underdog stories, nor introduced as an exotic talent from the other side of the world. He entered the locker room with wary glances, polite but guarded nods, and a chilly atmosphere that said more than any greeting. On the PGA Tour, where history, reputation, and connections are tightly intertwined, Vijay was viewed as someone with a reputation record, even though no verdict had ever been pronounced, even though there was no final conclusion to seal his fate. He began competing, and soon proved that his skills had not faded. Solid rounds, long and straight shots, a consistency that made opponents take notice. Vijay won tournaments, then won more, but each victory did not bring trust. Instead, it brought whispers, questions asked behind his back, lingering looks that lasted longer than necessary. People didn't say it outright, but everyone understood. He's good, but is he trustworthy? And it was in that gap between being good and being trustworthy that Vijay began living two distinct lives. On the outside, he was a consummate professional golfer, arriving on time, practicing rigorously, speaking briefly, never causing a stir. On the inside, he was a man always tensed in a defensive posture, as if every shot was a defense plea, every round an endless self-trial. Vijay didn't smile much, didn't make friends quickly, didn't join the inner circles that help people become more liked on tour, and that reserve was quickly labeled as cold, difficult, distant. The media prefers characters who are easy to read, faces that tell a complete story in a few lines. Vijay was not. He spoke little, avoided questions that could be misinterpreted, and kept a safe distance from everyone. But in an environment where friendliness is an invisible currency, that distance became evidence against him. The more he won, the more he was scrutinized. The more silent he remained, the more he was misunderstood. There were weeks when Vijay played the best golf in the field, yet the articles afterwards still opened with suspicion rather than recognition. There were moments when he stood on the podium, accepting a trophy without feeling relief, because he knew this win would not end the questions, it would only make them louder. And so, he chose the only way he knew, tightening discipline, raising his own standards, working more than necessary to ensure no mistake could become an excuse. Yet the price of that choice was prolonged isolation. Vijay rarely allowed himself to relax, rarely believed he was in a safe space. Even after proving his ability, he still mentally prepared for the day suspicion would return. His double life from then on was no longer a vague concept. By day, he was the competitor in front of crowds, answering the press with careful words. By night, He was the man self-examining, self-questioning, reminding himself that one lapse could cause everything to collapse. Others found confidence once they were established on tour, while Vijay found a form of permanent vigilance, and that very vigilance, though it helped him survive and win, also gradually eroded his ability to be liked, to be trusted, to breathe a sigh of relief like a normal person. Returning to America, Vijay Singh did not just bring his clubs and ambition, he brought an unresolved history. And in a world where first impressions often decide everything, he was forced to learn how to live with a label he did not create. From then on, every one of his victories carried two layers of meaning, one for the leaderboard and one for the silent inner battle, where he continued to stand firm not to be loved, but to avoid being pushed out of the game one more time. After establishing himself on the PGA Tour, but still not being fully trusted, Vijay Singh chose the harshest path to survive, discipline to the point of self-destruction. He practiced as if every session was a confrontation with the risk of disappearing, as if slowing down even one beat would immediately give the world a reason to push him back to the sidelines. While many golfers sought balance between competition and recovery, Vijay did the opposite. He hit more balls, practiced longer, stayed on the range when others had left long ago. Mornings started earlier than usual. Afternoons stretched until the light was no longer enough to see the ball flight clearly. For him, rest was not a reward. It was a danger. Every hour not spent practicing stirred the fear that he was opening the door for suspicion to return. His body began to protest quietly, but persistently. Back pain appeared and lingered. Wrists grew sore after thousands of swings. Knees lost their former flexibility. But Vijay did not see those as signs to stop. He saw them as the price to pay, as proof that he was doing enough, even more than necessary. Accumulating injuries did not slow him down. They only made him tighten his discipline further, as if enduring long enough, intensely enough, would force his body to submit to his will. There were no public complaints, no interviews detailing the pain, because he understood that any display of weakness could be misinterpreted. In the world where he was always under scrutiny, pain had to be hidden, and fatigue had to be swallowed whole. Vijay learned to live in a state of constant tension, where every swing was not just a technical motion, but an affirmation that he was still here, still strong enough to continue. There were periods when he practiced as if running from time itself, trying to build enough distance between himself and the past so it couldn't catch up. But the past didn't need speed to cling to him. It only needed one moment of slowdown. And so, Vijay did not allow himself to slow down. Deep inside, he carried a belief that was both simple and ruthless. If I stop, I will be erased. That belief didn't need to be spoken. It was present in every decision, every schedule, every way he treated his own body. While others extended their careers by listening to their limits, Vijay extended his by ignoring them. It was an effective strategy in the short term, but deeply destructive in the long run. His body gradually bore the indelible marks of a prolonged war, while his mind grew accustomed to never relaxing. Discipline, the very thing that had saved him from oblivion, also became an invisible cage, keeping him in a state of permanent vigilance. He no longer knew what it felt like to compete without carrying fear, no longer remembered the last time he stepped onto the course feeling at ease. But Vijay accepted that, because for him, exhaustion was still better than disappearing. Pain was still more bearable than suspicion. And in that choice, he kept moving forward, carrying a body that was wearing down day by day, and a will that never allowed itself to let go, believing that as long as he could still stand on the course, he still existed in the story the world had never truly wanted to tell about him. When Vijay Singh reached the peaks that every golfer dreams of, that moment did not explode the way people usually describe a major champion. It arrived heavily, slowly, and carried more pressure than relief. The Masters, then the PGA Championship titles, seen as passports into history, should have been the reward for years of endurance, for ruthless discipline, for a body worn down to its limits. But for Vijay, victory did not open the door to freedom. It only closed off more unnamed silences. He stood on the course, looking at the scoreboard, confirming he had done what very few in history could do. But inside, there was no bursting joy, no moment of letting go, no sigh of relief. Instead, there was a cold awareness that from this second onward, every gaze would scrutinize even more closely. Every suspicion would grow more sophisticated, and even the smallest mistake would be magnified many times over. The media recorded the wins, but did not embrace the man behind them. Articles still brought up the past, still asked questions, still kept a safe distance, as if no one was ready to give Vijay the full trust a major champion usually receives. He did not become a representative face, did not become a celebrated icon, but remained a name that needed to be watched, needed to be verified. Victory, instead of erasing doubt, became a new challenge, proving this was not a fluke, that he was not just lucky, that he deserved it. In Vijay's world, there was no concept of enough, because every milestone reached only raised the standard he had to meet in the future. Some win majors to turn to a new chapter, while Vijay won majors to continue a war that had never stopped. Joy, if it existed, had no time to appear before being suppressed by the invisible responsibility of maintaining a flawless image. He understood that one slip, one poor round, and everything would revert to the old ways, or even harsher, because now he stood higher to be pulled down from. In press conferences, the questions did not revolve around emotions or the journey, but drilled into sustainability, the ability to repeat success, whether he could maintain the level, and Vijay, as usual, answered briefly, carefully, leaving no openings. But that very caution was interpreted as coldness, further reinforcing the image of a distant man. Inside, he clearly felt a painful paradox. The greatest titles of his career did not bring a sense of security, but only forced him to tighten discipline further, practice more, and stay more vigilant. Each major victory brought a new fear that expectations had risen to a level with no room for error. Vijay did not allow himself to savor the moment, because savoring meant negligence, and negligence meant the risk of suspicion returning. Deep down, he understood he was living in a ruthless cycle. To be recognized, he had to win. To hold the wins, he had to endure more. And to keep enduring, he had to sacrifice his own emotions. The Masters and PGA Championship were not the end of the journey, but a reminder that the road ahead would be even stricter. While others lifted the trophy and started talking about legacy, Vijay looked toward the practice range, where he knew he would have to return sooner than everyone else, because this victory was not enough to free him from the past. It only forced him to keep proving himself, in a world that was never truly ready to believe that this man could simply be a champion without a question mark attached. When Vijay Singh rose to the world #1 position, it should have been the most complete moment of an athlete's life, the point where every sacrifice is finally repaid with absolute recognition. But for him, that peak opened the deepest chapter of loneliness. On the rankings, Vijay's name stood at the very top, undeniable, irrefutable by numbers or statistics. But in the story the world wanted to tell about golf, he still stood on the edge. Every passing week, he faced endless comparisons, questions repeated to the point of exhaustion, articles placing him next to other icons only to subtly emphasize what he lacked: charisma, iconic status, the ability to represent the sport. Vijay won, but his victories were not told as inspiring stories. They were presented as facts, needing explanation, even needing suspicion. He was not the face of golf, not the person the media wanted on magazine covers as the symbol of an era. Instead, he was the one placed under a microscope, where every win was analyzed to find out why it happened, and every loss magnified as proof he didn't belong there. At the very top, Vijay felt no shared joy, because that joy seemed to have no place in an environment full of doubt. Victory celebrations, warm congratulations, the side stories others enjoyed, all became luxuries for him. He entered the locker room like an outsider, even though the leaderboard confirmed he was the leader. There were days when Vijay wondered if he had done enough, but that question was quickly silenced by a cold truth. In this world, for him, there was never a concept of enough. The #1 spot was not a reward. It was a new burden, heavier than anything he had carried before. Every eye turned toward him, but not with admiration, with scrutiny. Every step was watched, but not to protect, to wait for the moment he stumbled. Comparisons became a form of silent mental violence, because no matter what Vijay did, he was always measured against a different ideal, a different standard, as if his success only had value when judged by who he was not. And in that whirlwind, he gradually realized a bitter paradox. Standing at the absolute highest did not mean standing alongside anyone. Vijay had no group embracing him, no community standing behind to shield him from the doubts. He stood alone, on a cold peak, where the wind blew strongest, and there was no shelter. On long nights after rounds, when the noise died down, he clearly felt the emptiness that victory brought. No shared triumph, no collective memories to share. Just a man asking himself how much farther he had to go to be seen as a complete person, not just an object of comparison. At the height of his career, Vijay Singh was not allowed to be tired, not allowed to be discouraged, because any sign of weakness would be interpreted as proof that the #1 position was only temporary. And so, he kept pushing himself, kept practicing, kept competing at an intensity that even younger players struggled to match. But the price of standing at the very top, with no one beside him, was a profound loneliness that seeped into every thought, every decision. Vijay understood he had reached the place many dream of, but he also understood that this place was not warm. It was cold, empty, and had no room for weakness. The victories that followed did not lessen that feeling, they only made it more familiar, like an inseparable part of success. Vijay Singh's peak was not marked by cheers, but by prolonged silence, where he learned to accept that some victories only create greater distance between himself and the world. And in that distance, he continued to stand firm not because he was supported, but because there was no other choice. A man at the very highest, looking down at everything, but when he turned to the side, no one was there, just the wind and the silence of a summit he had paid for with his youth, his health, and his emotions to reach. When the stadium lights went out and the noise of the rankings faded away, Vijay Singh returned to his family as a quiet refuge, but it was never a place of complete peace in the usual sense. His family always stayed low-key, avoiding the media, never appearing on magazine covers, never told as part of the success story, and that privacy was both a choice and a consequence of a life always lived in defensive mode. Vijay rarely spoke about his wife and children, not because of a lack of love, but because he was not used to turning private things into words, and even less used to sharing wounds that he himself could not name. In the rare interviews, he once admitted that golf had taken a lot, taken time, taken presence, taken moments that a husband and father should have had. But that admission came late and brief, like a statement that slipped out and was quickly swallowed back, because Vijay did not know how to linger in emotions. For him, family was the safest place, but also the place where he felt he did not fully belong, because the long years tied to schedules, practice, and travel had created a gap that was hard to fill. He was present in terms of responsibility, but not always present mentally, and that emptiness did not cause dramatic explosions or noisy tragedies. It smoldered like a small echo that never faded. Vijay was not cold within the family, but he was awkward in expressing love, awkward in voicing fatigue, and awkward in asking to be understood. Meals happened in silence, conversations were brief, trips were rushed before he hit the road again, all building into a feeling that he was living beside his family more than with them. And that very thing made him carry a very personal form of guilt, not loud, not publicly self-blaming, but always there in the rare moments he allowed himself to pause. There were nights, after tense rounds or victories that brought no joy, when Vijay came home and realized he did not know where to start talking about what he had gone through. He was used to solving everything with discipline and action, but family was not a place that could be fixed with more practice or doubled effort. There, presence and sharing were what mattered, and those were the skills he had never been taught. Family, in that way, became the clearest mirror reflecting the cost of the double life. A man strong in the public world, but fumbling in his own emotional world. Vijay loved his family that needed no proof, but that love was often shown through responsibility, through protection, through keeping them out of external controversies or scrutiny, more than through words or gentle gestures. He chose silence as a way to keep them safe, but that silence also built invisible walls, making the distance hard to name. The tragedy in Vijay's family did not come from big events, no public breakdowns or fierce conflicts, but from the things missed. Evenings, he was not there. Children's growth moments only heard about later. Conversations cut short because of an early flight the next day. And the most painful part was that he was aware of it all, but did not know how to change when the wheel of his career kept turning. Vijay had stood at the top of the world, faced tremendous pressures, but when facing his family, he had no strategy, no plan, no map to follow. There, he was just a man carrying accumulated fatigue over many years, trying to keep everything intact by not speaking about what was cracking inside. And that very effort, though born from love, made family a safe but distant place, a place he could return to, but never fully shed the armor he had worn his whole life. This tragedy did not bring him down, did not turn the story into something sensational, but it clung to him persistently, reminding him that there are losses that cannot be measured by titles or rankings, and there are sacrifices that never get named, but still exist clearly in every quiet moment of a man who had grown so used to being strong that he forgot how to be vulnerable in front of the people he loved most. As time began to claim what was its own, Vijay Singh felt the change not through a clear collapse, but through small signs that gradually built up rounds that were less consistent, mornings when his body took longer to warm up, and shots that once came instinctively, now requiring extra calculation. The decline in form did not arrive like a disaster. It came as a quiet reminder that no one can outrun time forever, not even the man who had once forced his body beyond every limit. At the same time, the media turned away with a familiar coldness. No resentment, no explanation, just simply shifting attention to newer, younger names that better fit the story they wanted to tell. The articles that once analyzed every swing, every victory of Vijay's grew sparse, then disappeared, making way for other faces. No farewell, no long retrospective, just silence, as if his role had been fulfilled. For many people, that moment might spark anger, might lead to complaints or efforts to cling to attention, but Vijay did not. He was too accustomed to being left behind, too familiar with the feeling of no longer being needed, and so he did not resent, did not attack, did not try to remind the world who he once was. He simply stepped back quietly, like someone who had been mentally prepared for this scenario for a very long time. Deep inside, the familiar sense of abandonment returned, not as sharp as the first time, but heavier because it carried memories of all the previous ones. Vijay realized that his career, no matter how illustrious, could not escape the ruthless law of attention. When you are still winning, you are seen. When you slow down, you become invisible. And the most painful part was not losing the spotlight, but realizing that the spotlight had never truly belonged to him. In these years, Vijay competed with a different mindset. No longer the hunted one, no longer the man who had to prove everything to the world, but someone trying to preserve his own dignity in silence. He knew he was no longer at the center, but he did not let that turn into bitterness. Instead, he focused on what was still within his control, preparing for each round, respecting the sport that had given him everything, and not hurting himself by comparing to the past. There were afternoons when the course grew empty, and spectators left earlier. Yet Vijay stayed, finishing his round with the same seriousness as the days when he was world #1. Not because someone was still watching, but because he did not know how to live any differently. The media could turn away, the crowds could thin out, but the habit of endurance and responsibility to his profession had rooted so deeply that he needed no witnesses to continue. Still, in the rare moments he allowed himself to look back, Vijay could not escape a feeling of emptiness, an emptiness not from failure, but from realizing that the long journey he had traveled left few companions at the end. He did not blame the world, because he understood the world had never promised fairness. He simply accepted it quietly, the way he had accepted the doubts, the silences, the times he was pushed to the sidelines throughout his life. This sense of abandonment did not panic him, but it reminded him of the boy back in Fiji, standing alone on the practice ground, understanding that if he did not stand firm on his own, no one would stand with him. And just like then, Vijay did not collapse. He stepped back one step, then another, not to disappear, but to find a different rhythm of life, where his value was no longer measured by headlines or fleeting attention. In that quietness, he continued to exist, carrying a sad calm, knowing that some chapters in life do not end with applause, but with prolonged silence, where one is left only with oneself, and memories of the days when the world once needed him. When Vijay Singh moved to the PGA Tour Champions, he no longer carried the heavy expectations that had weighed on his shoulders for the previous 3 decades. At this stage of life, there was no world #1 ranking to defend, no scrutinizing eyes on every shot, no pressure to prove he deserved to be there. Vijay stepped onto the course with a different mindset, slower, quieter, and somewhat weary, like someone who had traveled too far to still be in a hurry. The PGA Tour Champions was not a battlefield where he had to defend himself every day. It became a personal space where he could play golf for himself, not for anyone's approval. The rounds took place in relative quiet, with thinner crowds, less media, and in that sparseness, Vijay found a kind of calm he had never experienced before. No one demanded that he represent the sport. No one compared him to another icon. No one questioned the legitimacy of each victory. He was allowed to exist without explanation. Golf, after many years, returned to its original essence, a space to think, to feel each swing, each step on the fairway, each silent moment between shots. The double life that had shaped most of his existence began to dissolve slowly but irreversibly. Vijay no longer had to split himself into 2 different people, one for the public and one for himself. He no longer needed to tense up to appear strong, nor hide the signs of age-related fatigue. But that dissolution did not mean complete healing. The scars of the past remained, etched into the way he moved, into the persistent pains in his body, and into silences that lasted longer than necessary. There were days he played well, days he played poorly, but the biggest difference was that results no longer determined his own sense of worth. Vijay began allowing himself to stop, allowing himself to rest without guilt, allowing himself to walk off the course without wondering if the world would still remember him tomorrow. Still, this peace did not arrive as a complete gift. It carried a gentle sadness, like the feeling of someone finally sitting down after a long journey, only to realize the body is too weary to fully enjoy the moment. Vijay did not forget the years of suspicion, did not forget the obsessive practices, did not forget the feeling of standing at the top with no one beside him. Those memories did not vanish when he moved to a different tour. They simply receded into the background, becoming the foundation for every thought. But for the first time in his life, he did not have to fight them every day. He could let them exist without resistance. The PGA Tour champions gave Vijay a late form of freedom. Not dazzling, not fully liberating, but enough for him to breathe more slowly. He began to see golf as an old friend who had once hurt him, once demanded too much, but who had also been the only thing that stayed with him throughout his life. No more battlefield, no more confrontation, just rounds played at a moderate pace, where he could hear the wind more clearly, feel the grass under his feet more distinctly, and realize that he was still here, not to prove anything, but to keep living. Vijay's double life did not disappear completely, because old habits are not easily released, but it no longer dominated every decision. On the outside, he remained a professional golfer, still serious, still disciplined. On the inside, he began allowing himself to weaken a little, allowing himself to accept that there were wounds that could not be repaired, only carried. And in that acceptance, Vijay Singh found a fragile kind of peace, not enough to erase all the pain, but enough for him to keep moving forward without having to brace himself as before. The PGA Tour champions did not erase the scars, but it gave him a space to live with them, slowly, quietly, and for the first time in his life, without having to pretend he had never been hurt. As the pace of life slowed down, and the rounds no longer carried the weight of survival, Vijay Singh began facing his past in a way he had not allowed himself for decades, without justification, without defense, just looking straight at it. Looking back on a life that had never been carefree, he clearly saw the chain of links connecting from his childhood in Fiji, from the early formed loneliness, from the 1985 cut that never truly closed, to the years of bracing himself under suspicious lights. Vijay did not regret in the usual sense. He did not wish he had chosen a different path, did not wish he had been softer to be more loved, because he understood that those very harsh choices were what kept him standing when everything could have collapsed. But that lack of regret also did not bring serenity, because understanding the price does not mean being able to get it back. There were years that had passed and could not be reclaimed, relationships that had maintained distance and could not return to their original state, and a body that had endured too much and could not become whole again. Vijay looked in the mirror and saw a man who had grown so used to living in vigilance that he had forgotten what carefree felt like, a man who had won by not allowing himself to relax, and therefore did not know how to fully enjoy anything. He understood that he had lived true to his circumstances, but those circumstances had never been gentle. The victories that were once goals now became memories, and those memories contained not only glory, but also full of empty spaces. Empty spaces of evenings that could have been lighter, of stories that could have been told sooner, of emotions that did not need to be suppressed so tightly that they became habit. Vijay did not blame himself harshly, because self-blame is also a form of useless regret. But he did not deny that part of his life had passed in a state of constant defense, making everything carry the color of duty. He understood that he had learned to endure too well, to the point that endurance became the only language to face the world. And when age forced him to slow down, that language was no longer enough to express what remained inside. There were mornings, standing alone on an empty practice range, when Vijay realized he no longer had to prove anything, but also no longer had many chances to change how he had lived. The tragedy of maturity lies there, not in what was lost, but in the late clarity that the price had been paid in full, only it could not be refunded. He did not try to rewrite history, did not seek late vindication, because he understood that peace, if it came, could only come from accepting the entire picture, both light and dark. Vijay Singh moved through this phase with a sad calm, carrying the knowledge that he had walked the entire path in the only way he knew, and that although that path had taken him to undeniable peaks, it had also taken away the ability to live more lightly. Facing the past, he did not bow his head, nor hold it high, just stood still and looked, accepting that there are lessons that only become clear when it is too late to change them, and that maturity sometimes is not finding the answers, but living with the questions that no longer need to be answered. The legacy of Vijay Singh does not appear in the way people usually expect from a sports legend. It is not tied to dense tribute videos, not retold through glamorous stories of inspiration or widespread adoration. His legacy exists in silence, in the empty spaces he was forced to cross, and in the invisible doors he opened for those who came after. Vijay was not loved in the easy way, did not become a friendly role model for the public to embrace, but he also cannot be erased from golf history, because what he achieved is undeniable by emotion or prejudice. His influence spread slowly, without imposition, without declaration, but persistently. Golfers coming from lands far from the center, those carrying complicated pasts, those who do not fit the traditional mold of this sport, they look at Vijay's journey and see a possibility of existence. He did not promise that the path would be easy, but he proved that it is real. Vijay cleared the way, not with words, but by standing firm in places where many thought he did not belong. He showed that greatness does not necessarily come with adoration, that there are people who have to pay with loneliness for the right to remain in the game. In the way he practiced, competed, endured, and did not retreat, there is a different definition of greatness, one not based on admiration, but on the ability not to disappear. That legacy is especially important for those on the margins, those without privilege, without strong backing, without a beautiful story to tell from the start. Vijay showed them that history is not only written by those who are loved, but also by those who refuse to leave even when not welcomed. He did not change golf by making it louder, but by expanding the boundaries of who is allowed to stand at the top. In a sports world that prefers easy-to-tell icons, Vijay became a necessary but uncomfortable one, reminding that success does not always wear a likable face. The tribute to him, if any, should not be loud, because loudness was something he had to avoid his whole life. Honoring Vijay Singh is acknowledging that there are people who carried history in silence, who changed the structure of a sport without needing to be placed on the highest pedestal of public emotion. His legacy lies in the fact that he was there, that he endured, that he won in his own way, and that he left a mark that cannot be erased, even if not covered in widespread love. It is a legacy that needs no fireworks, no cheers, but endures persistently like an undeniable truth, that golf, and the world in general, had to become a little wider because Vijay Singh passed through it. As the story reaches its conclusion, Vijay Singh today no longer stands in any debates about status, nor at the center of the comparisons or suspicions that clung to him for most of his life. That man has grown old quietly, without noise, without announcement, without seeking a late explanation for what happened. He does not need to be loved in the mass sense, because he has lived long enough to understand that crowd love is fragile and conditional. He also does not need vindication, because vindication, if it comes too late, only brings another kind of emptiness. The only thing Vijay needs now is to be himself, not the version always on the defensive, not the image the media once pinned on him, but the person who existed behind all the forced roles. Vijay's double life was never an intentional deception. It was not two faces, but two layers of survival stacked on top of each other. One layer for the world, where he had to prove, endure, stand firm under the lights and suspicion, and one layer for himself, where he quietly gathered the fragments of emotion so as not to be swept away. For 30 years, those two layers were inseparable, because if separated, he might have disappeared very early. Vijay learned to survive by not allowing himself to collapse publicly, by keeping every wound inside, and by accepting that peace, if it came, would always arrive late. Today, as he walks more slowly, as his body carries pains that no longer need hiding, he does not seek complete redemption, because he understands that there are lives not written to end in full release. There are lives that only end in acceptance. Vijay accepts that he lost many things: carefree moments, lighter years, the ability to be loved naturally. But he also accepts that if he had not taken that path, he might not have existed in golf history in any way. What he carries as he grows old is not just titles or memories of victories, but the full weight of what he endured to not disappear from his own life. The final image of Vijay is not a legend celebrated in brilliance, but a man quietly walking off the course, carrying his old clubs, scars that no longer need hiding, and a sad calm. He does not look back to demand the world remember him in any particular way, because he has lived long enough to understand that the world's memory is always selective. What matters more is that he still remembers who he was, what he went through, and how he stood firm when no one stood with him. The double life, at this final point, is no longer a burden to maintain, but an inseparable part of his personal history. Vijay does not try to reconcile every contradiction, does not try to make his story easier to hear. He just lets it exist as it is. Rough, weary, but real. And in that reality, there is a quiet dignity that no title can grant, the dignity of someone who endured long enough to no longer need to prove anything. As the story closes, there is no prolonged applause, no moment of complete redemption, just the image of an old man carrying everything he lost and everything he endured to not disappear from his own life. And perhaps, for Vijay Singh, that is the final form of victory, not brilliant, not cheered, but enough for him to continue the remaining years as the most complete person he can become. When looking back at the entire journey of Vijay Singh, what lingers is not the number of major titles, the World No.1 ranking, or the records on the PGA Tour, but a feeling of sorrow for a man who had to live his whole life in a defensive state. From childhood in Fiji, where golf did not exist as a legitimate dream, Vijay learned to endure rather than dream. The 1985 incident, when he was accused of altering a scorecard but never given a full chance to clear his name, became the silent cut that shaped his entire later life. In the story, we clearly see how Vijay had to live a double life. On the outside, a golfer with discipline to the point of cruelty, obsessive practice, accepting bodily decline, and accumulating injuries. On the inside, a person always afraid that if he stopped for one step, he would be erased from history. Even when he won majors, became world #1, victories did not bring release. They only increased the pressure to keep proving himself, while the media remained suspicious and compared him to faces easier to love. Family, which should have been a place of peace, became quiet distance because he did not know how to express wounds after so many years of suppression. The lesson for Americans from this story is not just in the spirit of overcoming hardship, but in the cost of equating human value with achievement. Vijay Singh reminds us that success does not always come with recognition or love, and a society that only celebrates easy-to-tell winners can unintentionally abandon the most resilient people. In the end, greatness is not just winning, but the ability not to disappear, to keep dignity and identity even when the world turns away. Thank you for staying until the very end to listen to the quiet but deeply heavy story of Vijay Singh. If you appreciate journeys that are not glamorous but very real, like this, please hit subscribe to continue joining us. See you in the next video, where we will step into another life, with victories, losses, and endurance that the stadium lights often overlook.